They thought my inheritance was theirs. Until I exposed their greed with one final move. My name is Diana. I am 76 years old, and 3 months ago my own family sat in my living room and asked me when I was going to make things official, meaning, when was I going to sign over my house, my savings, and my late husband's pension to them, because as far as they were concerned I was just holding on to it for them. What they didn't know was that I had already been to the courthouse. I had already met with a lawyer. And I had already set a trap so quiet, so patient, that by the time they realized what I'd done, there was nothing left for them to take. If you want to know how a 76-year-old widow outsmarted the very people who thought she was too old and too soft to fight back, stay with me to the end, because the final move still makes me smile every single morning. Before I go on, if stories like this speak to you, stories about people who get underestimated and come back stronger, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next, and tell me in the comments where you're watching this from tonight. I love reading where all of you are tuning in from, and it means more to me than you know that an old woman like me has friends all over the world listening to her story. Let me start from the beginning, because you need to understand who I was before you understand who I became. I married my husband when I was 22 years old. We built a life together out of almost nothing. A small rented apartment, 2 jobs each, and a dream of owning a home someday. Took us 11 years, but we did it. We bought a modest house on a quiet street, and over the next 4 decades we filled it with birthdays, holidays, arguments, laughter, and eventually grandchildren running through the hallway. My husband worked in a factory for 36 years. I worked as a school secretary for almost as long. We were not wealthy people. We were careful people. We saved. We didn't waste. And slowly, without anyone really noticing, that carefulness turned into something substantial. A paid-off house, a modest but steady pension, and savings that we had quietly built for our retirement and eventually, for whoever we chose to leave it to. My husband passed away 2 years ago. It was sudden. A heart attack on an ordinary Tuesday morning while he was watering the garden. I found him there, kneeling by the tomato plants he loved so much, and my whole world folded in on itself in a single moment. I won't dwell on the grief because that's not what this story is about, but I will tell you this. Grief has a way of showing you exactly who stands beside you, and who is simply waiting for their turn. I have 2 children. My son is named Michael, and my daughter is named Claire. When their father died, they were both there for the funeral. Both cried real tears. Both hugged me tightly and told me they loved me. I believed them. I still believe that somewhere underneath everything that happened next, there was real grief in that room. But grief, I learned, does not stop people from calculating. It started small. A few weeks after the funeral, Michael came by to help me organize Dad's paperwork. That seemed reasonable enough. There were bank statements, insurance documents, the deed to the house, all sitting in a filing cabinet my husband had always managed. I let him help. I was exhausted and I trusted him. But I noticed he lingered a long time on the folder that held the deed and the account statements. I noticed he asked a lot of questions that weren't really about organizing anything. Questions like whether I had thought about simplifying things by adding his name to the house title, just in case something happened to me too. I brushed it off as a son worrying about his mother. I was wrong. Then Claire started calling more often, which at first felt like a blessing. She called to check in, ask how I was sleeping, whether I was eating. But the conversations always seemed to drift toward the same place, toward the house, toward what Dad would have wanted, toward gentle suggestions that maybe the house was too much for me to manage alone, and that it might be smarter to sell it and split the proceeds now, while everyone's on the same page, rather than waiting. I want to be fair here. Losing a parent brings up real fears about the future. I understand that some of what they said may have come from a place of genuine concern. But concern doesn't usually come with a calculator already running in the background. And it became painfully clear, over the following months, that the concern I was hearing had far less to do with my well-being and far more to do with what I represented. A house worth a significant sum, savings my husband and I had spent 40 years building, and a pension that still paid out monthly income. The moment that changed everything happened on a Sunday afternoon. My son, my daughter-in-law, and my son-in-law all came over for what they called a family lunch. I made a roast the way I always did on Sundays, the way I'd made it for 40 years. Partway through the meal, my son cleared his throat and said they wanted to talk about the future. Meaning my future, my house, my money, all of it, laid out on the table like a business proposal. They had brought papers. actual papers. A rough outline of how they thought my estate should be divided, drawn up without me, without a lawyer, without so much as asking whether I even wanted to discuss it that day. My daughter-in-law, who had never once asked how I was doing since the funeral, suddenly had opinions about capital gains taxes on the house. My son-in-law, a man who had barely said 10 words to my husband while he was alive, was explaining to me how a living trust would protect the family's assets. The family's assets. Not my assets. The family's. As if everything my husband and I had built with our own 2 hands, over 4 decades of factory shifts and school office paperwork, had somehow already stopped being mine the moment he died. I sat there and listened. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply asked one question. And what happens to me in this plan? Where do I live? What do I live on? The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. Nobody had actually thought that far. In their plan, I existed as an obstacle to be managed, not a person to be cared for. That night, after everyone left, I sat alone in my kitchen for a long time. I thought about my husband kneeling in that garden. I thought about the years we spent skipping vacation so we could pay off the house early. I thought about every extra shift I picked up at the school so we'd have something to leave behind. And I made a decision. If my children had already decided in their hearts that everything was theirs before I was even gone, then I was going to make absolutely sure they understood, in the clearest possible terms, that it was not. The next morning I called a lawyer. Not the family friend who had done our wills years ago, and who I suspected might mention things to my children out of old habit. A new lawyer, recommended by a woman I'd met at a grief support group, someone with no connection to my family at all. I told her everything. She listened without judgment the way good lawyers do, and then she asked me the question that changed the course of everything that followed. Diana, what do you actually want to happen to your estate, separate from what anyone else expects? Nobody had asked me that in months. I sat in her office and I thought about it seriously, for the first time since the funeral, without anyone's expectations pressing down on me. And here's what I decided. I decided that my children would still inherit. I am not a cruel woman, and despite everything, I love my son and my daughter. But I restructured everything quietly over the following weeks, so that the terms of that inheritance would depend entirely on how they treated me while I was still alive, not on how confidently they could plan a future around my death. First, I placed the house into a trust that could not be sold, mortgaged, or borrowed against by anyone but me during my lifetime, with instructions that it would only transfer to my children upon my death, and only if certain conditions were met. Second, I moved a portion of my savings, money that had quietly been growing for years, money my children didn't even know existed because my husband had kept it separate for emergencies, into an account earmarked for my own long-term care, completely outside anyone's reach or influence. Third, and this is the part that still makes me sit back in my chair and smile, I wrote a letter. A real letter, notarized, attached to the will, explaining in my own words exactly what had happened that Sunday afternoon, and exactly why the terms of my estate looked the way they did. Then I waited. I didn't tell anyone what I'd done. I let the weeks pass. I let my son continue his gentle hints about the house. I let my daughter continue her phone calls that always circled back to money. I smiled, I nodded, I said things like I'll think about it, and inside I felt something I hadn't felt since before my husband died. I felt like myself again. Not a grieving widow to be managed. A woman with a plan. The final move came 3 months later, on what would have been my husband's 79th birthday. I invited the whole family over, the same way I had for that fateful Sunday lunch. I made the same roast. And after the meal, I told them I had something important to share. I watched their faces light up. Actual light, actual anticipation, because they assumed, after months of gentle pressure, that I was finally ready to sign something over to them. Instead, I handed each of them a copy of the letter my lawyer had helped me prepare, and I asked them to read it in front of me. The letter explained, calmly and without cruelty, that I had overheard and understood exactly what that Sunday lunch had really been. An attempt to divide up a life I had built with their father before that life had even ended. It explained that I loved them, that I forgave the impulse that grief and fear can create in people, but that I would not be treated as an inconvenience standing between them and an inheritance. It explained the trust, the protected accounts, and the conditions now attached to everything, conditions that required them going forward to build an actual relationship with me, not a transactional one built around my eventual death. And then I told them the part that wasn't in the letter. I told them that for every year going forward that passed without a single unsolicited conversation about my house, my money, or my estate planning, I would personally increase what I planned to leave to a local charity that had helped women in my grief group, women who had nobody checking in on them at all. I told them the meter was already running, and it had been running since that Sunday lunch 3 months earlier. The silence in that room was different from the silence after the lunch. That first silence had been the sound of people caught off guard. This silence was the sound of people realizing, all at once, that the quiet old woman they'd been managing for months had been 3 steps ahead of them the entire time. My daughter-in-law tried to laugh it off, calling it extreme. My son-in-law tried to reframe it as understandable but maybe too harsh. My daughter cried, and for a moment I wondered if those tears were for me or for the money. My son sat very still and said almost nothing at all, which told me more than any words could have. I want to tell you that everything healed perfectly after that day. But I promised you an authentic story, not a fairy tale. What actually happened was messy and, I think, more honest. My daughter-in-law and son-in-law kept their distance for a while, clearly stung. But my son and my daughter, after the initial shock wore off, began showing up differently. Not perfectly. Not without the occasional slip back into old habits. But differently. My daughter started calling to ask how I was actually doing, not how the house was doing. My son started visiting on weekends just to sit with me. No papers in hand, no talk of trusts or titles. It's been almost 3 months since that birthday dinner, and the charity fund I mentioned that day hasn't grown by a single dollar, because for the first time since their father died, my children have simply been present. Not because a court forced them to be. Not because they were hoping to inherit more. But because the alternative, laid out so plainly in front of them, finally made them understand what they stood to lose that had nothing to do with money at all. I share this story not out of bitterness, but because I know I am not the only older woman sitting in a quiet kitchen somewhere, watching her own family circle her life like it's already over. If that's you tonight, I want you to hear this clearly. You built what you built. You earned what you earned. And you are allowed at any age to protect it, to set conditions, and to remind the people around you that love and inheritance are not supposed to be the same conversation. If this story meant something to you, please make sure you've hit that like button before you go. And if you haven't already subscribed, now is the perfect time, because there are more stories like mine coming. Down in the comments, tell me where in the world you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and it warms this old woman's heart more than you know to see how far these words travel. And if someone in your life needs to hear that it's never too late to stand up for yourself, go ahead and send this one their way. Thank you for sitting with me tonight. I'll see you in the next story.